Welcome, everyone. This is Investor David Podcast, where I discuss history's greatest entrepreneurs and investors. If you like the following conversation, it would mean a lot to me if you like this video and subscribe to the channel. And now enjoy the conversation.
Reflective, actually. This book we're about to talk about, it really got under my skin in a good way.
I know exactly what you mean. To the audience, the book that we'll be discussing today is All I Want to Know Is Where I'm Going to Die So I Never Go There by Peter Bevelin. It's one of those deceptively simple titles that hits you hard once you dig into the content.
Yes, I've read it twice now. The title alone is like a compass. It makes you think about avoiding stupidity more than chasing brilliance. And Bevelin's way of distilling wisdom from thinkers like Charlie Munger, it's something else.
Let's start right there. This idea that avoiding stupidity is more important than seeking genius. It feels counterintuitive at first, doesn't it? Like we're so wired to want to win, to be right, to be exceptional. But Bevelin says, just don't be stupid. That's the game.
Right. It's a humility-driven mindset. When you start with, I might be wrong, you open the door to better decisions. And Bevelin, echoing Munger, pushes this idea that recognizing what doesn't work is more valuable than chasing cleverness.
I had to sit with that for a while because we live in a world obsessed with hacks and shortcuts and techs thinking, but Bevelin basically says, no, just figure out what not to do. Like the doctor who first learns how not to kill the patient before learning how to cure them.
Exactly. And what's wild is once you focus on avoiding mistakes, you paradoxically start making better choices. It's a kind of mental judo.
I like that, mental judo. And Bevelin doesn't just stop at saying, don't be stupid. He lists the kinds of stupidity to avoid. Confirmation bias, overconfidence, envy, authority, misjudgment.
Yes, that list is brutal because when you read it, you realize I do all of those things. Maybe not all the time, but definitely enough to matter. Like confirmation bias, it's such a sneaky one.
Totally. It's the mental equivalent of hanging out in an echo chamber and calling it research. We gather evidence for what we already believe and then feel smart.
And Bevelin's reminder is wisdom isn't about feeling smart. It's about seeing reality clearly, even if it bruises your ego.
I think that's one of the core lessons of the book. You can't outsmart life if you're not honest with yourself.
Yeah, and being honest with yourself is painful, but Bevelin frames it like a discipline. He's not saying, don't be stupid as an insult. He's saying it like a coach would. Like, the opponent isn't as dangerous as your own blind spots.
That's powerful. And it ties into something else he talks about, thinking through consequences, not just what happens now, but what happens next and next. Most people stop thinking at the first consequence.
Right? Bevelin encourages second-order thinking. What happens if this goes wrong? If it goes right, what unintended effects might it trigger? And not just intellectually, but habitually. You start training yourself to think in chains.
And it's tiring at first, like lifting weights for the brain. But the more you do it, the more natural it becomes to pause and ask, then what?
You know what's ironic? This, then what? Mindset makes you slower, but also more precise. And that's counter to how we're told to move in today's world. Everything's speed, speed, speed. Bevelin's saying, slow down. Look both ways. Don't walk into traffic just because everyone else is.
I love that analogy. Don't follow the herd just because they seem confident, because the herd can, and often does, run off cliffs.
It's the lemming problem. And Bevelin's book is like this personal defense manual against that kind of madness.
Absolutely. And speaking of defense, another concept I really liked was inversion, thinking backwards. Not how do I succeed, but how do I fail? And then not doing those things.
Yes, that's one of Munger's favorite tools too. And bevelin leans hard into it. He even writes that solving problems backwards can sometimes be easier than solving them forwards.
It's weirdly empowering because when you ask, what would cause me to fail here? You get brutally honest answers. Like, well, if I ignore red flags, if I get too greedy, if I lie to myself, and those answers become your playbook for not dying metaphorically.
And sometimes literally, depending on the decisions. Like if you're managing money, flying planes, leading people, those tiny lapses can turn into disasters.
Bevelin's whole point, I think, is that most bad outcomes start small. They begin with a stupid decision that we justify, and then the consequences snowball.
That's what makes this book different from most self-help or business books. It's not about building empires. It's about not building empires. It's about not building your own collapse.
Well said. This might be a good place to pause and breathe for a moment. We've covered a lot already. Stupidity, bias, inversion, second-order thinking, but we've only scratched the surface.
Agreed. And the next layer, I think, is understanding how we train ourselves to think better. Not just know what's wrong, but build better mental models. Let's go there next.
Perfect mental models. Bevelin leans heavily into those. He calls them tools for the mind. Not every situation needs a hammer, but if all you have is a hammer,
Everything starts looking like a nail. Yeah, he borrows that idea from Maslow, I think. But Bevelin's twist is have a toolbox, not just one shiny tool.
right? And the toolbox metaphor goes deep. You don't just collect tools randomly. You need to know when to use which one. Probability statistics, psychology, microeconomics, physics, biology.
And interdisciplinary thinking is the key. Munger always says, take the big ideas from different fields and apply them broadly. Don't be a narrow specialist who can't see the full picture.
It reminds me of the phrase Bevelin uses, a latticework of mental models. Each model is a piece of the scaffolding, and together they support clearer thinking.
But you can't just read about them once and expect to think better. Bevelin makes it clear these models are habits. You have to work them into your thinking every day.
And the tricky part is, most of the time we're not even aware we're thinking poorly. Our brains love shortcuts, heuristics, biases. So using mental models is almost like installing a second operating system in your mind.
Yeah, a system that constantly asks, what am I missing? What assumptions am I making? And maybe most importantly, what if I'm wrong?
I think that last one, what if I'm wrong, is a mindset most people actively avoid. But Bevelin treats it like a sacred mantra. Doubt is not weakness. It's a safeguard.
And that goes back to the idea of avoiding stupidity, because you don't need to be right all the time. You just need to not be wrong in reversible ways.
Yes.
That line hit me hard. Don't risk what you can't afford to lose. So simple. Yet how many people violate that rule every day?
Too many? Especially when ego gets involved. We double down on bad bets because we want to look smart or right or brave. But Bevelin says it's braver to walk away than to let your ego make decisions.
That ties in with what he says about skin in the game, too. When you're insulated from the consequences of your decisions, your thinking gets sloppy.
Yes, people make dangerous decisions when other people are footing the bill. So Bevelin, again borrowing from Taleb, says, make sure you pay a price if you're wrong. That's the ultimate test of belief.
And I think that's where accountability comes in. Not just personal accountability, but designing systems where bad decisions actually have consequences. Because if you can fail upward, you have no incentive to learn.
Exactly. And Bevelin uses historical examples, leaders, companies, disasters, to show that disconnect. Like, look what happens when no one's held responsible. Systems rot. Cultures collapse.
And individuals keep repeating the same bad patterns because there's no feedback. One of Bevelin's most underrated points is good judgment is impossible without feedback,
And not just any feedback, accurate, timely, painful feedback. The kind that teaches you something.
which is rare. Most of us surround ourselves with comfort and approval, people who nod when we speak, like posts we make agree with our plans.
Bevelin says, find people who challenge you, who ask why, and how do you know? Who force you to think harder.
And that takes courage, because it's easier to feel right than to be right, easier to be flattered than corrected.
True. But correction is how you build real wisdom. And this book is full of that idea. Wise people aren't born, they're built through stress and failure and honesty.
He even talks about how people should design for failure. Not assume they'll get it right, but build systems that are resilient when they get it wrong.
That's such a powerful shift. It's not, how do I win every time? It's, how do I survive when I lose?
Yeah. And that's when I started to realize this book isn't just about better thinking, it's about long-term survival, mental survival, emotional survival, financial survival.
And in a way, even moral survival, because Bevelin makes a case for integrity too. Cutting corners might help today, but it corrodes your compass.
I noticed that. He doesn't preach, but he insists you can't separate ethics from intelligence. If your model of success involves cheating or lying, then your thinking is already broken.
And your success is unstable. It might look shiny, but it's hollow. Bevelin's not interested in looking good. He's obsessed with being solid.
Being solid, that's such a great phrase for it. You read this book and realize it's not about impressing others, it's about protecting yourself from yourself.
Yeah, the real enemy isn't the market or your boss or the competition. It's your own impulsiveness, your own short-sightedness, your own refusal to stop and think.
This is why I keep coming back to Bevelin's line, avoid what causes destruction. Because most of our problems are self-inflicted. Not always, but often.
And the people who thrive aren't necessarily the smartest. They're the most disciplined. They know when to say no, when to shut up, when to wait.
And when to walk away. Man, that lesson hit me deep. Not everything you fight is worth winning. Not every opportunity is worth chasing.
Sometimes survival is the victory, living to fight another day, keeping your reputation, your sanity, your integrity.
You know, Chris, the more we unpack this book, the more I realize it's not a business book, it's a life manual.
Absolutely. We should go even deeper into the emotional and philosophical parts of the book, like how to handle envy or deal with uncertainty or resist impulsive desires.
Yes, let's go there. Because the real challenge isn't knowing the right thing. It's doing it when it's hard.
So let's talk about emotions. Bevelin doesn't just focus on thinking errors. He dives into emotional traps too. And envy, man, that chapter made me sit up.
Same here, we like to think we're rational creatures, but envy slips through the cracks. Someone gets a raise, buys a house, hits a milestone, and suddenly we're comparing.
And Bevelin just cuts through the noise. He writes, envy is stupid because it has no upside. It doesn't motivate. It doesn't help you grow. It just poisons your mind.
And it's sneaky because we rationalize it. I deserve that too, but Bevelin reminds us someone else's win is not your loss.
Exactly. And he quotes Munger a lot on this. Like that idea. You can't be a truly happy person if you're envious of others. Because envy makes you focus on the scoreboard, not your own game.
I love that framing, your own game, because once you focus on what others are doing, you lose track of your own progress, and your decisions stop being about value and start being about status.
And that's dangerous. Bevelin brings up people who take massive risks just to catch up with their peers. But the catch is you're chasing a moving target.
Which brings us to another emotional trap, greed. They're related. Envy makes you want what others have, and greed makes you overreach to get it.
And Bevelin's warning is simple but brutal. Don't risk what you need for what you don't, especially if you're doing it just to impress people who aren't even paying attention.
I think it's so important how he reframes wealth. He doesn't say money is bad. He just says if money becomes your only goal, you're setting yourself up for misery.
Right? Wealth isn't just cash, it's freedom. Freedom from bad bosses, freedom from bad deals, freedom from desperation. But chasing more just for show, that's a prison.
And that mindset of enough, that's rare. Most people don't ask, what's enough for me? They just keep climbing even if it's the wrong mountain.
Bevelin encourages clarity before ambition. He basically says, define your values before you start chasing outcomes. Because if you don't, someone else's values will define you.
And that kind of self-definition, it takes real inner work because you have to ask hard questions. What am I optimizing for? What am I willing to trade?
And what am I not willing to trade? Your time, your health, your integrity. Those are precious. And Bevelin's message is don't sell them cheap.
That reminds me of his warning about impulsiveness. How most bad decisions come from acting too fast, feeling too much, thinking too little.
Yeah, he says, when you're emotional, wait, sleep on it, give it time, and if you still feel the same tomorrow, then act.
Such a simple rule. But in practice, it's so hard because we live in a world that rewards speed, not reflection.
And we treat impatience like a strength. But Bevelin flips that. He says patience is a competitive edge. Because while others are chasing noise, you're waiting for signal.
And waiting for your moment, not the moment everyone else is hyped about. That takes not just patience, but confidence in your own process.
Which brings us to uncertainty. Bevelin says, don't fear it, prepare for it. He writes, accept uncertainty, but reduce ignorance.
Man, that line stuck with me. We can't control outcomes, but we can control how informed we are.
Yeah, and Bevelin's point is uncertainty isn't the enemy. Unpreparedness is. Most people want certainty before they act, but wise people act with margin for error.
And that margin, Bevelin calls it the buffer. Whether it's cash, time, energy, it's what gives you resilience.
It's the difference between stress and collapse. With a buffer, you bend. Without one, you break.
And I think that idea, the buffer, is deeply tied to humility, because if you believe nothing can go wrong, you won't prepare. But if you believe anything can go wrong, you start building margin.
And humility isn't weakness. In Bevelin's world, it's strength. The humble thinker doesn't pretend to know everything. They say, I might be wrong, so let me prepare.
And that humility shows up even in how he handles decision making. It's not about being flashy. It's about being right enough, not perfect, just not stupid.
And that phrase again, avoid stupidity. It's everywhere in this book, not because he's being harsh, but because he knows that most damage is self-inflicted.
So when you combine all this, mental models, emotional discipline, humility, margin, you start to build a kind of thinking armor.
Yeah, that's a great term. Thinking armor. You're not immune to bad outcomes, but you're less vulnerable to your own worst impulses.
And that's where Bevelin shines. He's not saying, here's how to win big. He's saying, here's how to not lose it all by being blind to your own flaws.
And honestly, that might be the most valuable advice you can get. Because in the long game of life, avoiding big mistakes is winning.
I think we should explore how Bevelin thinks about learning, how to actually get better at thinking over time.
Yes, because knowledge isn't the end, growth is. Let's dig into that.
So let's dive into learning. Bevelin doesn't treat knowledge like a trophy. He treats it like a tool, only useful if it helps you think better.
Right? And he constantly emphasizes the process over the outcome. It's not about being right all the time. It's about getting less wrong over time.
And that means you have to update. He borrows that idea from scientists. Treat beliefs like hypotheses. Test them, revise them, drop the bad ones.
Exactly. And most people don't do that because they get attached to being right. But Bevelin says that attachment is dangerous. He quotes someone saying, "I'd rather be right than consistent."
That hit me hard. We cling to old opinions out of pride, not logic. But what if the facts have changed? What if you've changed?
Then holding on just makes you stubborn, not strong. And Bevelin makes a strong case for active learning. He says, don't just absorb, challenge, ask questions, invert problems. Learn not just what works, but what fails.
And that idea of inversion, it's a game changer. Instead of asking, how do I succeed? Ask, how do I fail? And then avoid that.
That's pure Munger. Invert. Always invert. And Bevelin shows how this applies everywhere, from investing to relationships to decision making.
Like he says, if you want a happy marriage, don't just copy happy couples. Study what ruins marriages, then do less of that.
It's so pragmatic, and that's the core of Bevelin's mindset. It's not about lofty ideals. It's about practical wisdom. What works, what doesn't, and how not to screw it up.
And speaking of not screwing it up, he talks a lot about self-control, how intelligence without discipline is like a fast car with no brakes.
Yeah, and that chapter hit me personally because it's easy to learn things and still act irrationally. You know you shouldn't respond to that mail in anger, but you do it anyway.
Because emotion hijacks reason. And Bevelin says, you don't fix that by suppressing emotion. You fix it by creating space between feeling and action.
He calls that space the gap. And that's where your life gets shaped. Not in the feelings you have, but in what you do with them.
And to strengthen that gap, you need routine systems. Rules you follow even when your brain is on fire.
He gives the example of having a checklist for decisions, just like pilots do. Because when emotions run high, logic runs low. You need tools that don't rely on willpower.
And that ties into another big theme. Don't trust yourself blindly. We all have biases, blind spots, and overconfidence. So build in some humility, some friction.
It's ironic, right? We think trusting ourselves is strength. But Bevelin says it's smarter to question yourself. Double. Check. Get feedback. Build filters.
And that's not insecurity. That's self-awareness, knowing where you're likely to screw up, and putting guardrails in place.
And one of those guardrails is surrounding yourself with people who challenge you. Bevelin says, avoid echo chambers. Seek friction, not flattery.
That part resonated deeply. Most people seek agreement. But growth often comes from discomfort, from someone saying, I don't think that's right, and making you think harder.
And that's what this book does to you. It makes you uncomfortable because it doesn't give you answers. It gives you questions and then forces you to examine your mental habits.
And if you're honest with yourself, you realize how lazy your thinking can get, how often you rely on heuristics, shortcuts, gut feels, when what you need is clarity and effort.
It's like Bevelin is holding up a mirror and saying, this is your brain on autopilot. Are you okay with that?
And if you're not, then you've got work to do. But good news, this book is like a manual, not just for thinking, but for living better.
And living better isn't about perfection. It's about being a little more aware, a little less reactive, a little more thoughtful.
Exactly. And now that we've talked about learning and thinking, I think we should explore Bevelin's views on decision making in high-stakes situations.
Yes, especially how to stay rational when the pressure's on, when time is short, and the cost of error is high.
So, decision making under pressure. Bevelin really digs into this. He says pressure doesn't just expose your thinking, it magnifies your flaws.
Yup, he gives examples of people who had all the right information, but still made terrible choices because they rushed or panicked or got emotionally hijacked.
And that's the core idea, right? Knowledge isn't enough. You need a calm mind. Bevelin calls it, a prepared mind makes fewer stupid decisions.
And he brings up the concept of base rates, how most people ignore them in favor of stories. Like, we'll say, this startup feels special, instead of asking, what percentage of startups in this space actually succeed?
Right. He's warning us against narrative bias, the seduction of a good story over cold numbers. And when the stakes are high, you have to think probabilistically.
But people hate thinking in probabilities. We want certainties, guarantees. But Bevelin says life doesn't work like that. You don't get guarantees, you get odds.
And your job is to improve the odds and reduce the downside. That's all. It's not sexy, but it's how smart decisions get made.
He also brings up checklists again, especially in stressful environments. Pilots, surgeons, investors, they use checklists to stay rational when their brains want to go rogue.
And that made me rethink how I approach pressure. Instead of relying on gut, maybe I should rely on process, slow down, follow steps, reduce risk.
He says, never make a permanent decision based on temporary emotions. And that's brutal wisdom, man. How many people ruin their careers or their lives with one bad call in the heat of the moment?
And his solution isn't, don't feel. It's feel, then wait, give it space, give it time. Let the emotion cool.
Because emotions lie. They feel true in the moment, but most fade. What stays are the consequences.
And that's why Bevelin talks about second order thinking. Don't just ask, what happens if I do this? Ask, and then what? And then what? Follow the chain.
Exactly. First order thinking is easy. This makes money. Second order is, will this create trust, burn bridges, increase risk?
And sometimes the right move is not moving, just sitting still, letting chaos pass. Not every situation demands action.
But that's hard. Inaction feels like weakness. But Bevelin reframes it. Sometimes doing nothing is the smartest decision.
Especially if your instinct is to overreact. Some people lose because they try too hard to win.
He tells that story of investors who made a ton, not by being clever, but by being boring, by avoiding the dumb stuff everyone else was doing.
And that loops back to a recurring theme. Avoid stupidity. You don't have to be a genius. Just don't blow yourself up.
He says it like this: it's not about brilliance, it's about avoiding disaster. Because the game of life rewards survivors, not sprinters, not gamblers, just the ones who stay in the game.
And to stay in the game, you need to know your limits. Bevelin really hammers that. Circle of competence.
Yeah, that part made me pause. He says, know what you don't know. Stay in your lane. Don't confuse being smart with being capable in every domain.
And that's so common. We get good at one thing, and suddenly we think we're brilliant across the board. But Bevelin warns arrogance is expensive.
And humility is cheap insurance. He says, if you're not sure, say you don't know. There's no shame in that.
And that's rare, because we live in a culture that rewards certainty. But Bevelin argues, certainty is often a bluff. Real intelligence is comfortable with doubt.
And that's how better decisions get made, not by faking confidence, but by admitting uncertainty and adjusting accordingly.
So to recap, Bevelin wants us to make decisions by preparing our minds, avoiding emotion-driven choices, thinking in probabilities, staying inside our competence, and resisting the urge to act fast.
That's it. Slow thinking, honest thinking, humble thinking.
So where does this take us next? What's the thread that connects all of these ideas?
I'd say character. How you think is one thing, but how you act consistently over time, that's character. And Bevelin has a lot to say about it.
Then let's go there. Let's talk about how he defines strength, not just mentally, but morally.
So, character. For Bevelin, it's not some vague moral virtue, it's a decision framework. He says who you are shows in what you do when nobody's watching.
And he links character directly to long-term success. He says, skills might get you in the door, but character keeps you in the room.
And it's especially important when things go wrong, because that's when your values get tested. You don't rise to the occasion. You fall to the level of your habits.
He tells those stories of people who looked brilliant in good times, but collapsed when the tide went out because they lacked integrity or discipline or courage.
Right. And courage isn't about being loud or dramatic. It's about doing the right thing when it's inconvenient, when it costs you.
And Bevelin makes it clear, you can't borrow character, you build it, slowly, painfully, by doing the hard thing again and again.
And I love how he ties this to reputation. He says, reputation is what others think of you, but character is what you think of yourself.
Yeah, that really stuck with me because you can lie to the world, but it's exhausting to lie to yourself. At some point, that friction breaks you.
And he quotes someone, maybe Seneca, saying, a guilty conscience never feels secure. So character isn't about being noble. It's about peace of mind.
And you know what else he connects to character? Trust, he says. If people can't predict your behavior, they can't trust you. And without trust, everything falls apart.
Especially in business, he says, partnerships, deals, careers, they run on credibility. And that comes from consistent behavior over time.
And not just when things are going great. He says, the real test is in adversity. How do you act when you're losing? When you're criticized, when your ego's on the line?
And that ties back to ego. Another huge theme. Bevelin isn't subtle about it. He says, ego is your enemy because ego wants to be right, not effective.
And that shows up in all the dumb decisions we make. We ignore warnings. We overreach. We take credit for luck, all because we want to feel smart instead of be smart.
He says, kill your ego before it kills your judgment. And that's not easy because ego whispers in your ear, you deserve this. You know better.
But the cost is huge. Relationships suffer. Learning stops. You start defending yourself instead of improving yourself.
And Bevelin says something savage. An insecure ego is a liability in any environment that rewards reality.
That one punched me in the gut because most of us think we're logical until reality humbles us.
And humility isn't self-deprecation. It's clarity. It's knowing your limits, seeking feedback, being open to correction.
And when you combine humility with character, you become anti-fragile. You don't shatter under stress. You learn. You adapt.
And Bevelin closes the loop by saying, strong character is the ultimate edge because it amplifies every other skill.
You can be brilliant, but if you panic under pressure or can't be trusted or let ego drive decisions, you lose. Character is the multiplier.
And he's not preaching. He's showing through stories, through history, through failure.
And that's what makes this book different. It's not a pep talk. It's a warning from someone who's seen what happens when smart people forget to stay human.
Yeah. And it's not a book you read once. It's one you wrestle with. It's a conversation you keep having with yourself.
So let's bring this home, Chris. If there's one core message from Bevelin, one thing listeners should take away from this conversation, what would you say it is?
Him, I'd say, learn to think clearly, act slowly, and stay humble, because in the long run, the person who avoids stupidity, honors their values, and keeps learning wins.
And I'd add, don't try to be the smartest person in the room. Be the one who asks the right questions, who listens deeply, who learns constantly. That's the real edge.
Beautifully said.
And I hope listeners take this away. It's not about instant gratification or being perfect or winning every time. It's about staying grounded, staying in the game, and getting better over time.
That's the key. So I'll leave it here. Be patient, be humble, and above all, be smart about not being stupid.
Hope you all enjoyed this conversation. Thanks for tuning in. We'll see you soon.
Take care.